Uh, this whole session talks about industries for the future, and frankly, it is perhaps tempting for every generation to think that we are living at a time when there is an inflection point. So we may be allowed that indulgence and say, we too, this generation is living at a time when there is an inflection point. And there is an inflection point across so many dimensions. We're talking about digital technologies and the way it's going to change every aspect of our lives. And I think it gets into things like IoT, Industry 4.0, wearables, sensors everywhere, smart cities. So there is such a wide range of applicability from this range of technologies. One can look at what could happen with health and healthcare, because we've just come through a devastating episode across the globe with the pandemic, and all of us have been, waking up from our reverie to saying, wait a minute, we better look after our health. And today there are many technologies, sensors, data, all aimed at first prevention and then hopefully a cure. So well-being is becoming such an important aspect. But rather than drift all over the place, I'll take Santhanam's cue and focus a little bit on one domain, which in my view, will also become an important industry for the future. And this is an inflection point that the global industry, the auto industry is going through, are pivoting towards electric mobility. Almost 20 years ago, I'd been roped into a small council that was constituted by the governor of Västra Götaland in Sweden. It's the southern, southwestern part of Sweden, around the city of Gothenburg, and a very highly industrialized part of the world. I mean, you have Volvo, Scania, SKF, AstraZeneca, Ericsson, you name it, you've got all sorts of technologies there. And yet they were worried about the future and how are they going to look after and sustain the prosperity of that state. And you look all over the world, and we look at role models. You look at the Boston corridor in the US, you look at the Bay Area in California, but they all have one common set of building blocks. And it starts with good educational institutions, not just the IITs alone, but a full spectrum of educational institutions to deal with both primary, secondary, and specialized education. Dr. Narayanan earlier mentioned an important point. It's not just enough to have an educational ecosystem. You need a social environment that attracts young people, where young people want to live there, young families want to develop and grow in that environment. This is an important, people talk about the lovely life you can have in Boston, but that's part of what that ecosystem offers, and that is a big contributor to the kind of economy that Massachusetts is able to develop. So you need the educational systems, you need the social environment. To be able to scale jobs, and most often any industry we talk about requires scale. And to do that, you need a certain minimum starting point for a trained labor force. Beyond this, of course, you need adequate infrastructure so that industries, companies can operate with efficiency. And most importantly and finally, it should be an environment where it's an environment that is conducive to inviting capital. Ease of doing business is something that people often measure, but it's an important element of inviting capital. By all these measures, there is a lot in Tamil Nadu for us to feel proud about. This is a state that has done reasonably well, particularly among our peer groups, but it would be, in my view, limiting our conversation to the topic, to the glass that is half full, that is so easy to do. The more challenging and the more interesting task for us is to look at the glass that's half empty and look at what more should we do, what more can be done. So I think while I am encouraged that we fare well, and Dr. Narayan's pointed out, even by comparing with ourselves with our peer groups among states in India, we still have to look over our shoulders and look at other states catching up. But it's less about just the states catching up. It is where should we take not only our state but our country over the next couple of decades. So, focus on the EV business. EV business is also something that can only develop in an ecosystem. Many of these industries are not point solutions. When one looks at what Tamil Nadu's trajectory and course has been in this sector, here again, there is a lot to be encouraged by. The full cycle of this industry starts with an ability to produce the core elements. At the end of the day, when you distill an electric vehicle, you have to distill it all the way down to the fundamental energy storage systems, the battery cells. Cells for an electric vehicle industry are like silicon chips and memory chips and processor chips to electronics. Today, sadly, almost 99% of all vehicles sold in India have cells sourced from China. And if we are to develop this industry in any big way, I think we're going to have to address this fundamental deficiency that we're going to make cells. And making cells, just like we've talked about making core chips and core processors, is not a small-scale industry. It requires significant investment. And so this requires significant commitment of capital. Fortunately, Tamil Nadu has already candidate companies that are very interested in making cells in India. I'm sure Mr. Balaji here will talk about his initiative from the group later on, committed to making sure that the most fundamental building block of electric vehicles, battery cells, can be made in India, and in the context of this conference, specifically in Tamil Nadu. The ecosystem therefore also naturally depends on a whole range of components. I mean, just because you make an electric vehicle doesn't mean you get away from all of the related ancillaries and components. Tamil Nadu is extremely well placed here because we have the benefit of, we have perhaps been flatteringly referred to as the Detroit of the East. Whatever that label symbolizes, it does recognize a very large manufacturing footprint we have in India or in Tamil Nadu for automotive components and manufacturing of auto parts. That is going to be an extremely valuable asset to pivot again to addressing the needs of an electric vehicle industry, because at the end of the day, you're still going to need castings, forgings, you're going to need electronic hardware, you're going to need pumps, you're going to need gears, you're going to need transmission units, and so on. So Tamil Nadu is extremely well placed, and not just in what I would call the traditional industries, because there already we have many of the stalwarts in the state, the TVS group, the Rane group, the Amalgamations group, the Murugappa group, all getting involved in some way or the other to support the components needed in the EV industry. But we've also seen a number of newer players come in. Foxconn is a corporate citizen or a corporate resident in Tamil Nadu, and they have announced rather ambitious plans to pivot some of their manufacturing into manufacturing the kinds of components needed for the electric vehicle space. In a way, this is mirroring what's happening globally, where high volume, high scale electronics manufacturing is beginning to pivot to electric vehicles, and we will see that also happen in the state, boosting the state's ability to support electrification of mobility with components. Whenever you develop a new industry, at the end of the day, if we don't control the apex platform development capability, we become nothing more than a supplier state. And many states are satisfied with being nothing more than a supplier state. But when you start to control apex platforms, you then determine not only the course of that particular economic trajectory, but also elevate the levels of skills necessary for integration. This is why it's important that we house manufacturers of electric vehicles, and by this measure as well, Tamil Nadu is now already home to one of the largest two-wheeler plants that's going to come up in the world with Ola Electric. We have Ather, a wonderful example of a small startup that was probably housed here in this building. I recall funding a bunch of students in my days in Ashok Leyland on a student project, which ultimately became the core of Ather. And I know from their earliest start in this building and in this campus how they've grown, and they've announced plans to set up a big plant in Hosur. Ampere is another very important two-wheeler player, probably less in the news, but announced their plans to put up in Ranipet, again to the earlier point that we need to look beyond Chennai, putting up a 1 million unit plant for scooters in Ranipet. So we have a huge number of manufacturers coming in. I cannot leave out Ashok Leyland and their journey to become an electric vehicle manufacturer. They've carved out a brand new division of the company to be solely dedicated to electric vehicles, and they too have chosen to build their factories in Tamil Nadu. So Tamil Nadu has, by good fortune, a number of vehicle manufacturers also choosing to locate their manufacturing here. Two other points I would make rather quickly. You cannot have an electric vehicle ecosystem without charging infrastructure. And I think there are plans underway. It is probably well behind schedule, given the kind of potential this industry has to take off and run away. So there's a lot of work ahead of us in being able to roll out the kind of charging infrastructure that one would need to support this industry. Fortunately, thanks to some rather very clever engineering supported by an initiative at the Government of India, harnessing this instinct for frugal engineering, the Government of India has created an open source kind of a technology that will allow us to have an EV charge point that costs no more than 3,500 rupees. Highly scalable, but still operable by a smartphone connected to a back end, capable of doing analytics. So if you want to roll out thousands of EV charge points, it can be done affordably and potentially with a made in India solution. And the last point would be, of course, we need the right grid. There is perhaps it would be futile to develop a full electric vehicle industry and an ecosystem with a grid that is predominantly based on coal or fossil fuels. So the progress that we are making is encouraging in terms of making sure that the basket of energy sources very quickly pivots towards renewable. The targets for India for the fraction of energy that should come from renewables by 2030 is already about 40 to 45%. And as long as we stay on that trajectory, I think as this industry matures, we will have in parallel a growth in the renewable power. There's a lot going on in this industry. There's a lot going on in this industry in Tamil Nadu. So I feel there's a lot of reason to be encouraged. But once again, the glass is still half empty. There is a lot to do. We can aspire to really become the next generation Detroit of the East if we're able to harness this and cater not only to the evolving market in India, but it should be our aspiration to cater significantly to the emerging markets across the globe. And that's the goal I'd like to keep my eye focused upon. And I hope as Tamil Nadu, as a state, as it looks at its future, it looks at that part of the glass that's half empty and says, that's the game we should go after. And I think as we have seen, we have a lot of the building blocks to get there. From now on, it will just take our spirit and our conviction and effort to be able to achieve that goal. Thank you.